When you're 10 feet tall, everything is so small. I'm always bumping my head.
Welcome into the program this morning. It is Friday, y'all. I know that you're excited about this. The last vestiges of the holiday season are now pretty much dead. I mean, we had a half week this week. I know a lot of you didn't go back to work until probably Wednesday if you're anything like me. And so this was sort of a half week to get us back in the swing of things. Next week, we hit the ground running. It's Monday. It's back to business as usual. The holiday season is done with. I know. I'm sad too. I like the rest. I like it, but it is time to get the nose back to the grindstone. And so that is something that I know that just the same as it is here on the program with Tactics and everybody here at Cumulus Media, that's going to be the same for a lot of you. So we really do hope that you are ready to hit the ground running, because the last sort of feeling of the holiday season is going to be gone very quickly, and you're not going to have another holiday really until Valentine's Day. And let's be honest, that's not even a real holiday in the sense that you don't get off work for it or anything like that. So holiday season pretty much done with. But nonetheless, that means that there is a lot of news to get to, and we're going to continue to get to it and bring it to you right here from News Radio 1440. Speaking of, a little bit of local news going on here. There was a shooting in Millbrook, and a Montgomery resident was killed. A guy, 27 years old, named J. Wesley Hardy, and was killed in a exchange with the police officers. We don't actually know if it was an exchange of gunfire, because especially when it's a developing story like this, we try to only give you the facts. So we'll kind of rewind, give you some of the lead up to it, and then explain to you exactly what I mean by that. So the police noticed that there was a Dodge Ram, a 2008 Dodge Ram that was reported stolen. And so this 2008 Dodge Ram pulled into the parking lot at Marvin's. Now, for those of you within the sound of my voice that actually know the layout of Millbrook and know what that means, is Marvin's is right off of Highway 14. So one of the big highways there, it's not Main Street in Millbrook, but it intersects with Main Street, and it's probably, I would say Millbrook's busiest road now. Used to be Main Street. Now I'd argue it's probably Highway 14. A lot of businesses out there, lots of people. Marvin's, of course, a big hardware store out there. And when the police saw this guy turning into the parking lot, they said, hey, that matches the description of a stolen vehicle. So they go in, they investigate. When the guy gets out, they try to apprehend the suspect. They tell him to get out, get on the ground, and doesn't comply. And then he jumps into another vehicle. I don't know exactly why. I don't know if he was just closer to this vehicle or what, but he refuses to comply with the police officer's lawful orders, and so he jumps into a car that was apparently registered to him. So I don't know if he was doing an exchange or a drop-off or what was going on, but he goes to this parking lot there in Marvin's and jumps into this other car and takes off on Highway 14, speeding down the road. Highway 14, the speed limit there, it is a big road. It's a 4-lane. And it actually is 6-lane in certain places. But it's a big 4-lane road, and the speed limit is roughly 55, 45, depending on what part of 14 you happen to be on at the time. But he was doing at least, they said, 90. The reports initially said in excess of 90 miles an hour. So this is a very high-speed chase, and it would not have taken him long going at that speed to get to the intersection of 14 and 65. And then when he gets there, which is, I don't know, it'd be hard to... I'm bad with distances, but probably 4, maybe 5 miles, if that far. I don't even know that it's that far. I would guess that it's actually a little bit shorter. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but probably about 4 miles. And he goes down there and apparently makes a collision with 3 other cars. Now, I couldn't tell based on this if he collided with 3 cars at the same time. In other words, he hits one car and then runs into another one with that same car, or it was 3 separate collisions, just kind of grazes one and grazes the other and then smacks into the other one pretty hard. I'm not really sure about that. Some of the details were not available from our news partners at WSFA.com, but apparently he collided with 3 cars, and that was what caused him to eventually have his vehicle stopped, because very busy place down there at the intersection of 14 and 65. And because of that, he got out of the car, at which point he apparently produced a gun, according to the police reports. And when he did produce a gun, that was when shots were fired and the guy was taken down. There were initial eyewitness accounts that say that what happened is that there were about 5 shots fired, but if you're looking at video footage that was taken at the scene, not necessarily of the crime or of the gunfight or alleged gunfight happening, but afterward. Or sorry, during, but not, the camera's not pointed at it. You can't really see what happened, but that video footage shows, or you can hear about at least 12 gunshots go off. Now, we don't know whether or not the guy actually fired at the police officers. All the initial report says is that he produced a gun. So it is possible that he pulls a gun out, the police officers see his gun, and then several officers fire on him all at once. That is a very real possibility. It's possible he never actually fired a shot, he just produced the firearm. But I mean, when you're in a situation like that, you're surrounded by police officers, you've already just sped away trying to avoid arrest or avoid confrontation with the police officers, and then you pull out a gun. Yeah, the police officer is well within his right to assume that you are going to hurt him or hurt somebody else and take you down. And so that's probably what's going on here. And I don't know if he actually got any shots fired off, but either way, this seems like, just based on the outside looking in and the initial reports that we have, this looks like a 100% justified police shooting. And so they took the guy down, and we do want to point out that there was a police officer that apparently was injured. We're not sure exactly how, but pray for him and his family. It doesn't seem like it's life-threatening or going to be something that is going to be a huge issue for him, but nonetheless, it's a dangerous job. And we do salute and greatly appreciate all first responders, especially our police officers, who, most people, when they hear gunshots, when they hear something dangerous, they start running in the other direction. Police officers run towards it because it's their job to. It's their job to keep us safe, and I do appreciate the work that they do, and I appreciate the speedy response, because apparently there were no innocent bystanders that were injured, and thank God for that. But that is the story as we have it right now. And so I do want to thank our Millbrook police officers for doing their job and doing it so effectively, and doing so in such a way that it appears as though they limited damage to everybody else, and it doesn't seem as though any innocent bystanders were hurt in this particular exchange. Which, you think about that. You have 2 different instances where there are conflicts with the police officers. First in the Marvin's parking lot, then at the intersection of 65 and 14, both very highly populated areas, places with a lot of business, a lot of, you're going to see a lot of people walking around there, and a 90 mile per hour high speed chase. And there were 3 collisions, but apparently no injuries by anybody that was around there. That is, I don't know how that's anything short of God's divine providence looking out for people. And we are thankful for the police officers who, assisted that and did that and tried to keep us safe. And I appreciate the job that they're doing there. So the latest is that Aaliyah is going to take over, which, by the way, is standard procedure when you're dealing with an officer-involved shooting. That when you look at the facts, when you look at everything, make sure that everything was done by the book, that the officer shooting was done in a way that was consistent with their training. And that is what the police chief P.K. Johnson over in Millbrook said, that based on all their initial findings, that they believe everything was done by the book, that they acted in accordance with their training and with the rules that regulate police officers. But they turned the case over to the state officials at Aaliyah to make sure that everything's above board, and this is standard procedure. Now, this looks like a completely justified shooting, but it's possible that we have some details that we're not sure about. So if those come out, and if there's reason to suspect there was some wrongdoing, we'll report it. But right now, there's nothing to suggest that. Now, nobody is up in arms yet. But God forbid the shooting happens to be a black person. And I don't even know if the suspect that was shot was black or white. They didn't have a picture of it. They didn't mention it in the story. So, I have no idea whether or not there was a black person even involved in this. But I know that, and it's really sad that this was something that I was worried about as soon as I heard this shooting take place. I thought, oh goodness, I hope there's not a racial element to this, because if there is, I know that it's going to be a circus. But nonetheless, police officers who, based on all the information we have right here at the moment, appear to just be doing their job and actually doing it very well and keeping everybody else from being injured in a very, very difficult situation and a very dangerous situation for the public. And so it is possible that even if they did absolutely everything right and they were 100% above board, that if it just happened to be a white police officer and a black suspect, it is very, very possible that this turns into another case where they try to turn it into what happened in Hoover and try to do all these protests and everything else. And it's sad that we even have to worry about that, because I don't know, and nobody really knows except some of the people that have seen the footage and actually were there at the moment. But when it comes to these things, this should not be a concern. It should not be to us something that we have to worry about, the race of the police officer and the race of the person being shot at, that alone is going to be something that substantiates a narrative to try to drive us apart from one another. And unfortunately, that seems to be the case because, again, in Hoover, nobody knows what happened yet. And despite this, there have been weeks upon weeks of protest. It's been in the state and local news, goodness, since Thanksgiving. And keep in mind, we're past New Year's now. And people going and protesting at Steve Marshall's house for taking over the investigation, which, by the way, the state also took over this investigation. And because there doesn't appear to be a racial element, or at least not one that was reported, then nobody's up in arms about that because it's standard operating procedure, just like it was in Hoover. The district attorney seemed to have a conflict of interest, and through no fault of his own, and Steve Marshall even asserted that. I don't think that he's corrupt. I don't think that he would botch this investigation, but because there is the appearance of a conflict of self-interest, well, then we probably need to make sure that everything's above board and I'll take it over. You notice that nobody is protesting at Steve Marshall's house, at least not yet. I hope this doesn't turn into this. About this. And if this happens that it was a white suspect and a white police officer, you can rest assured that everyone will forget this story even happened within a couple of days. And there will be nobody protesting at Steve Marshall's house, or nobody crying police brutality or saying that the police were just out to kill somebody. You're not going to see that. If there is a racial element to it, I think that there's at least a chance that that narrative gets pushed. Now, granted, in this particular case, it's a little bit harder to be able to drum up support for it because you do have a suspect that was involved in a high-speed chase, did steal a car that they were pretty sure he was the suspect when he got out of the stolen vehicle, and then chased him down, and then he produced a gun. So I think even if there is a racial element to it, they're going to have a very hard time making that sell to the people around here. But, you know, as we've seen in some of these cases, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if all the evidence is against the suspect and with the police officer, then people still assume that because the police officer happened to be a different race than the suspect, that the police officer was doing so for racial motivation without any evidence of that actually taking place. And so I don't think that that's going to happen here, but, you know, we could see that. And I do think it's very telling that because no racial element has been at least reported on yet, that you don't see anybody up in arms about it or complaining about it, but you can rest assured if it is discovered that that was what took place, then that is going to be, there's going to be at least an aspect of it. I'm not saying it blows up as big as Hoover or anything like that. I'm just saying that you can rest assured that that is going to be something that they want to bring up. So speaking of local news, there's also something else going on. It's happening in DC, but from someone who is in the state of Alabama. Richard Shelby actually commented on this. An Alabamian has become the undersecretary of the Army. So basically the number 2 guy in the Army, a Alabama local, has been elevated to that particular position, and we do certainly salute him and his service on that, and we appreciate that. Very proud of a Alabama native being put in that very high position to help oversee that particular branch of our armed forces. Now, another Alabamian making some news, Bradley Byrne, who's a representative for the 1st District of the state of Alabama. That includes, like, you know, Mobile, that kind of thing. So he's in Alabama's 1st District, and he came out the other day. And Bradley Byrne, Honestly, if you're looking at his voting record, he started out really conservative. I mean, from Freedom Works and Heritage and some of the other organizations that keep track of these things, getting somewhere in the 80s. Sometimes, I think in 2016, he actually had an 88% Freedom Works mark. This year, he's really fallen off, and he only has a 56 rating when it comes to conservatism. And I've been really disappointed in 2018 by the performance by Bradley Byrne and some of the ways that he's voted. But I have to say this. He has been absolutely consistent and conservative when it comes to the border. And this is no different. In a statement that was issued as a response to the news that a girl was raped by a previously deported illegal alien in Shelby County, he came out and said this. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the story, a girl apparently residing in Shelby County, because of the records being sealed, we don't actually know the identity of the girl. All we know is the charges, which, by the way, means that we do know that it was not just a rape, it was a juvenile rape. So this absolute piece of human filth, who happened to be an illegal immigrant, went ahead and raped this girl, and this was someone who was previously deported. Somebody who was deported back in 2015 on drug trafficking charges in the state of Alabama. So he was in the state of Alabama, he was deported, and then came back to the state of Alabama, which is a sterling example of why we need border security. And Bradley Byrne is about to point that out in the statement we just read. When it comes to this, the federal government completely let Alabama down. They have a constitutional obligation, Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution, to protect the individual states from invasion. That is their job, according to the Constitution. And because we've been playing politics and failed to make sure that our borders are secure, this piece of trash that's already been caught once smuggling drugs into the state of Alabama got back into the United States and back into the state of Alabama. I mean, if there is a bigger case for a border wall and increased border security, which would include a wall, I can't find it. So this was what Bradley Byrne said. We have heard horror story after horror story about illegal immigrants who break the laws and hurt the American citizen. But Democrats have chosen to shut down a portion of the federal government instead of supporting stronger border security. We must fight to take action to prevent illegal immigrants from entering our country. This is a fight worth fighting. And he's absolutely right. This is 100% a fight worth fighting. And this is just one more example of it. We've seen case after case of this happening. You remember the girl from Iowa who had essentially the same thing and unfortunately was also murdered by the person that assaulted her. And Kate Steinle, I mean, we could go down the list. We could produce news story after news story. And this is really what this all boils down to. This is one of the main reasons that conservatives are so passionate about this. This was a person who should have never been here to begin with. And America has enough problems as it is without importing problems from other countries, without allowing people from other countries to come in and commit crimes. And here's the thing. If you're somebody that is willing to break the law and commit a crime coming into this country, crossing the border illegally, you are someone that is more likely to commit other crimes, to be willing to commit other crimes. Not saying everybody, but there is at least a decent amount, a plurality. I won't even necessarily say the majority, but even if we're talking about 10%, and it's larger than 10%, but I'm just using this as an example, even if it's just 10% of the millions of people, the hundreds of thousands of people spilling over our border every single year, then that's a significant amount of criminals that we are importing. And this is the reason that people got so up in arms and wound up, again, not necessarily something that I approved of, but when Donald Trump came out and announced his candidacy and said that there are rapists and drug dealers and I assume good people, was that a very concisely worded argument? No, it wasn't. Did he say it in the best possible way? No, I don't think that he did. But you know what? A lot of people saw that and gravitated to it and said, here's a guy that is willing to actually speak the truth about a lot of the things that are going on at the border. And they weren't real concerned with whether or not he worded it 100% precisely. That was an afterthought to them, and frankly probably should have been. Because there are so many people that are not willing to say, we got a lot of problems spilling across our border and nobody's doing anything about it. And that was one of the reasons that people did gravitate to the Trump campaign. when you think about this too, we're not only importing our problems, but we are expending our own resources to fix the problems that we're importing. So, for example, even if you're accounting for the tax revenue that is raised by illegal immigrants, and there are some that pay taxes, but even if you count that and count that against the ledger, we're still expending over $116 billion per year, not only in federal spending, but in state and local spending. In fact, a bulk of it in state and local spending when you're talking about things like services for police officers, fire department, to fix the very problems that we're importing. So we're not doing our job on the border by actually securing it, and then we're paying for it on the other side of the ledger, again, paying for it a second time when it comes to having to enforce the crimes that they commit and having to provide services, be that welfare, fire services, medical, public education, whatever. And we're losing $116 billion a year on that side of the ledger. And you're really telling me that we can't raise $5 billion, just $5 billion to help build a wall? That's absolutely insane. And this is the reason people get up in arms about this, because they see that we're importing problems, we're having to pay to import the problems, and then we're paying on the other side of it to fix the problems that they cause. This is the reason that conservatives get so up in arms about this issue. Let's go ahead and go to the phones. Good morning. What's your name?
Hi, good morning. This is John. I just wanted to, with regard to your topic,
Mm-hmm.
I just heard a position being stated on Progress Radio where they said, well, the conservatives here they're so concerned about the wall and being able to have security there. What about security inside in the country? They said these open carry people are the ones that are causing all the crime. They cause far more than those that come in across the border. That was just stated just a few minutes ago before I got on the radio.
Well, now, what's so hilarious about that is concealed carry permit holders are the most law-abiding demographic in the country, including if you stack them against off-duty police officers. We're more law-abiding than off-duty police officers.
Yeah. But, I mean, they said that, and of course, they tied with that, we don't care about our children, all we care about is our border. They don't care about the children, and they went back to
so they don't care
what happened, and they kick it back to that and compare it to the border.
Well,
one doesn't have much to do with the other one anyway, but nevertheless, that's what
I tell you what, it does in this case. Because I would think that someone that does care about the rape of a juvenile girl in Shelby County would be someone that is very concerned about the border. Because if we had proper border security, maybe this piece of trash wouldn't have got back in here to assault her in that way.
They would dismiss that.
Well, they might dismiss it, but facts don't care about
the
feelings. I know they would.
Do they care about that? I mean, they don't even look at that side of it. You have to be honest enough and have enough concern across the board on both sides to say, that's terrible.
Of course.
Regardless if it was an alien, illegal alien, or whoever it was, that's a horrific thing for a child to have to go through. So,
but here's the difference in that, because I agree with you 100%. Rape is horrible, and the victim is just as victimized regardless of whether the person is an illegal or not. But at least if the person is someone who is supposed to be here, who was born here, there's not a whole lot that you can do to prevent that. I mean, if somebody wants to go out and attack somebody, I mean, as horrible as that is, there's very little that we can do to prevent that. When you're talking about an illegal immigrant, this is someone who was not even supposed to be in the country, and we got rid of once and still came back because we failed as a federal government to secure our border properly. And so the reason I think people get more passionate about that is because this is a situation where a rape was easily preventable, and we didn't do our job, and we did not enforce the law the way we were supposed to, and that failing led to this girl being victimized.
Well, I'll make this accusation against them. I think they care more about illegal aliens than they do our own citizens.
Well, they certainly would vest more rights in them. And by that I mean there are certain things that they want illegal immigrants to have. There are programs that Democrats have supported for illegal immigrants to have, for example, free health care, free education. You look at the DREAM Act, free tuition in the state of California. They've opted for that, which the California citizens don't even get free tuition to their state colleges. And so you have certain privileges that are afforded and supported by Democrats for illegal immigrants that are not even afforded to our own citizenry. And if if you committed a federal crime, do you think there would be any Democrats saying that they should grant you amnesty on that?
No. And one of the things, too, all of those things give incentive for people to come.
Absolutely.
Because all I got to do is get into California and I can get a free college education. I would have taken that risk myself.
Mm-hmm.
With regard to the incredible amount of money that it costs to help 3 children get through college.
Yeah, well, you would know that firsthand, wouldn't you? You've had
Yes,
three of them go through that process. One's still going through it now, but
it's amazing, and to listen to the rhetoric on that side, which you have to get into their mindset to understand what they're thinking. And of course, one of them said that what's her name, Cortez, should be running for president because of. And then there was one that cussed this morning about impeach
45. Yeah, I know that's their title slogan. Well, here's the thing, and since we're talking about commentaries from the other side, I heard somebody this morning. Maybe it was yesterday. I think it was last night actually, and I can't remember if I was watching CNN or MSNBC. But one of them were talking about how unfair it is, how we're being unfair to the illegals because they live in such a poor country and they live in poor conditions. Look, I agree with them on that. And I've got no problem with someone wanting to make a better life for themselves and coming to the United States legally. But let's talk about fairness for a second. How fair is it that the policies that they're advocating for give certain things to illegals that we do not give to our own citizens and that we do not give to even legal immigrants, people that come through and do things the right way? If we're talking about equality and we're talking about treating people the same under the law, wouldn't that mean that we enforce our border laws for everybody? Because it's not fair to the people that actually spent 10 years in Honduras or Guatemala and actually came and immigrated to America the right way to just be basically sidelined for the sake of illegals that just skipped across the border 2 weeks ago.
That's true. I just hate to see it being cast like that because it's just unfair. And you should be given some benefit after having been a citizen.
Absolutely.
In this country. And if your family has been here for generations, I don't guess they necessarily deserve any more than anybody else who's just been here. But
right. I'm not asking for privileges or handouts. I'm just saying that they certainly shouldn't get them when I'm not getting them.
Yeah.
I'd rather nobody get them. I'm a libertarian. So
I heard someone say one time, but because of that policy that you're talking about, well, I'm going to finish up my education here and then I'm going back to my home country. The talk show host said, you don't feel any remorse or any, owe the country anything to stay here to add to it. The country said, no, that's why that was put into place, so I could take advantage of it and go back to my home country.
Well, they're not wrong.
Yeah. That's what she did, too. She was getting education in, that was in Florida.
Yeah.
So, nevertheless, that's the mindset. It's there. I'm supposed to take it and then go back and do my own thing.
Well,
there's a lot of that out there.
Unfortunately, that's a common attitude, but thank you so much for your call. I appreciate it. You have a good day. But here's the deal on this whole thing. We talk about fairness, and I'm not saying that there's not an argument to be made on that particular front. But if we're going to talk about fairness, how fair is it that the United States has to pay for other countries' failures constantly? And I'm not even talking about foreign aid, which is a huge mess. We've just given both, if you're looking at combined, the countries that are sending a lot of the illegal immigrants over, Mexico, South America, you're looking at roughly $10 billion in foreign aid. But even if you're not counting that, how fair is it that America is expected to be the dumping ground for all the unmentionables and crime and people that their governments can't take care of? Why is it that Mexico seems perfectly okay, and other countries too, but I'm using Mexico because they're our closest neighbor, of course. Why is it that they feel perfectly okay with those people that are not being taken care of, that don't have a great life, that are in squalor and poverty in their own country, just, getting rid of those people and letting them come to America, and then they're America's problem? They feel fine with that. Well, why don't we talk about that? Why don't we talk about that fairness? How is it fair to expect the American taxpayer, who's just trying to put food on the table and provide for their family, to be expected to give away a portion of their income to provide these services, including welfare, education, so on and so forth, for people that aren't even a part of this country, that don't pay into the system, that don't pay taxes? How is that fair? If you want to talk about fairness, let's talk about it from both sides. You can't just say, well, it's unfair from one side and not consider the other perspective. Because if we're talking about fairness, then we should consider both sides of the equation. And what is not considered is the American family that is paying taxes for the benefit of the non-citizen. That doesn't make any sense. As much as I'm against things like welfare and Medicare, Medicaid, all of these unconstitutional parts of the federal government, you know what? At least they are, at least in theory, going to American citizens. Some of these programs are now being reallocated and being used for the benefit of the non-citizen, which makes absolutely no sense, because at the end of the day, the federal government is a creation of the American citizen for the benefit of the American citizen. It doesn't mean that we as a people can't be concerned about people of other countries, but it does mean that on the governmental level, that organization should only exist for the benefit of the American citizen. We are going to shift gears here for a second, and I think that sometimes I don't talk enough about some of the really big ideas, and this is a rare opportunity to do so. So this is an older tweet, but sometimes I think I don't really hit on some of the major ideas, the big picture enough, and this is a real chance to get us to do this. So we're going to use this tweet mostly as just a jumping off point, but I think that this really shows a sentiment that is amongst the younger generation, amongst the millennials, amongst the people that are really big fans of the person that we're about to talk about, which is, of course, Senator Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders tweets out the other day in support of in support of socialism versus capitalism, as he usually does, and sort of brings up some points that we're going to break down. But since it's done over the internet, this is time for yet another installation of Breaking the Internet.
Where'd you hear that?
The internet.
And you believed it?
Yeah. They can't put anything on the internet that isn't true.
Where'd you hear that?
The internet. Oh, look. Here comes my date. I met him on the internet. He's a French model.
Bonjour.
So today's edition of... For some reason, it went to the wrong screen, but okay. So today's edition of Breaking the Internet, we go to Bernie Sanders. He has a tweet out from about a week ago, but he makes this claim. In 1980, CEOs made 30 times more than the average worker. Last year, the CEO to worker compensation ratio was 312 to 1. Together, we must finally create an America that works for all of us, not just those at the top. So there's a couple of really big problems with this claim. First of all, the income inequality argument, which is basically what this stems from. He's saying that there is a problem in this country because back in the year 1980, then people were making roughly 30 to 1 what their lowest paid employee was. Now it's about 312 to 1. So it stems from the idea that that is somehow bad. That is somehow evil. But a lot of people that buy into this argument never stop to think, well, why is that bad? Why is that a bad thing? And usually if they were to rationalize it, if you were to ask this question to them, they're going to come up with something along the lines of, well, it creates income inequality. The income inequality argument is dumb even in and of itself, because there is nothing inherently immoral about a boss making more than his employee. If they're both engaged in a mutually agreeable and mutually beneficial relationship where one person makes money and the other person does as well, then who cares? I don't really care if my boss makes way more than I do. The income inequality argument itself is dumb because it ignores the whole picture. If a very wealthy person gives you a job, then you're still better off than if you didn't have a job. It doesn't matter that they make a lot more than you. You're still making more money than you would if they didn't have that money to employ you in the first place. And so this is the problem with the income inequality argument as a whole, is that it doesn't look at the whole picture. It looks at a relationship between two individuals and makes the assumption that one person making more and one person making less is somehow wrong. Well, if you're doing the same work, then I kind of agree with them. If they have the same level of experience, they've been with the company for the same amount of time, and they produce the same thing, then to a degree I kind of see what they're talking about. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the CEO of a company, somebody that has put in a lot of work, a lot of risk, a lot of it probably his own capital in a lot of cases, to be able to risk his entire livelihood to be able to build his own company. I don't think that guy should be making the same as the guy who's the janitor, or the guy who's just started out at the company that the CEO may have been there for 30 years. And by the way, I'm not disparaging the janitor. There's probably quite a few janitors that make a lot more than I do. And I've done some janitorial work, not as a janitor myself, but being a maintenance man, you do have to do some cleaning up when you're at a hotel. And so, I've cleaned bathrooms and that kind of thing. There's nothing wrong with that. It's good, honest work. But the idea that somehow this person that's doing a low-skill job should be making the same as the guy making decisions and risking his own capital and risking his own livelihood at the top doing this is just silly. And here's the thing about the income inequality, and I'll explain to you why it's such a stupid argument. Let's say that you're in a situation where you are making $20,000 and your boss is making $100,000. Okay, well, that's income inequality. In fact, your boss is making 5 times more than you do. But let's say you had to choose between that and a situation where you're making $100,000 and your boss is making $100 million. Well, now your boss is making 100 times more than you are. But you would still pick, regardless of the income inequality, you would still pick the second scenario because you're making 5 times what you did in the first scenario. You'd much rather make $100,000 than you would $20,000. And who would blame you? You're still coming out on top. So the fact is, you're doing better regardless of how much your boss is making. My boss making more money does not mean that I'm making less. And it doesn't bother me if he makes a lot of money. If you're in a situation where everybody's making more, who cares if some people are making more than you? This is the problem with the whole system. The whole argument of income inequality is it is based upon envy. It is based upon the idea that they shouldn't be making that much. Because if you're looking at the results of capitalism versus socialism, the difference is in socialism, you have everybody poor, with the exception of a handful of fat cats at the top. Which again, I do think it's hilarious that socialism is always for the people, not the socialist. The socialist somehow always comes out on top. The socialist is somehow always provided for. And let's be honest, Bernie Sanders isn't exactly hurting for money. The guy has 3 houses. 3 very expensive houses. And so this idea that we should just give away all of our wealth, that people shouldn't be making that much more than other people, first of all, never works, because in a socialist society, there's always somebody that's making a lot. There's always somebody, for example, in Venezuela, you've got what's-his-face down there, Menudo, who was unfortunately caught eating a empanada on screen where he's got people waiting in line for 3 hours for a can of beans in his country. So yeah, the socialist never really misses a meal. It's the people that have to deal with the consequences of socialism. The masses, the faceless, human refuge that out there in the country. That's for you people. But let's just ignore that for a second. Let's just say that socialism worked the way Karl Marx would want to. Why would you opt to be in a system where everybody is making the same if you're making less than you would in a capitalist system? I don't really care how much money Bill Gates makes. I don't really care how much money, Warren Buffett or Oprah or any of those people, because it doesn't take away from what I have. Their income has no impact whatsoever on my income, unless it's a positive one. Because if you're operating in a system where people, to be able to become wealthy, have to make other people wealthy, or at the very least wealthier, in the process of doing so, then the rising tide lifts every ship. Bill Gates has made my life richer in a number of ways. Not because I've ever worked for him, and not because he's ever personally given me money, but the inventions that he's come up with have saved me a lot of time. I'm somebody that uses a Windows operating system a lot. The fact that I'm coming to you right now is the result, at least in part, of Bill Gates' ideas and his work. Because he invented the Windows operating system, which was a better operating system than any that existed. And the, progeny of that, the continuation of that system has continued to improve, made computers faster, so on and so forth. And so in so many ways, the reason that I am able to continue my career and be able to bring this content to you is because of a guy that I've never had any relationship with in a strict economic sense whatsoever, because he had good ideas and invented better technology that benefited everyone. I'm able to make money because of a good idea that somebody else had that I'm never going to see a dime of his money. And I'm fine with that. I'm okay with that. Bill Gates should be a very rich person because he made a lot of people's lives easier. And so by serving mankind in that way, by coming up with a really good idea that people liked, he was made richer and compensated for that. And he should be able to do that. And when it comes to this, when you're looking at this relationship between your CEO and your boss, I don't care if my boss is making 10,000 times what I am, as long as I'm making what I was promised. Because him having a lot of money means that I get more money in the process too. If he's coming up with good ideas and innovative new ways to come to audiences, then that grows my business, that grows my perception in the public, and I'm able to make more money as a result of that. And so I just don't understand this idea. It's all based upon the idea of envy, that they're just upset that there's somebody making so much more than them. I don't care. It does not bother me that other people are doing well. And I do think it's hilarious coming from Byrne because he talks about the people on top as if he's not one of the people on top. Again, Bernie Sanders is a part of the 1%. He is part of that population that is making a lot of money. And he's doing so at taxpayer expense because he couldn't get a job in the private sector. If you don't believe me, look at his personal history. The guy's never had a real job outside of working in the government. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, my father worked as a member of the government. He was a public school teacher, which is a employee of the state. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that or noble. I'm just saying that, let's be honest, Bernie Sanders would not be able to make it in the private sector. In fact, he tried and failed. The only job he's ever had is being a politician who spends other people's money. That's the only thing he's ever known. And so let's look at this from the average person in the 1980s to today, because he's asserting that somehow economically we were so much better off in the 80s as opposed to now because CEOs were making closer to their employees' wages. Again, let's look at whether or not the world is a better place and people in the 1980s are actually wealthier then than they are now. First of all, let's look at cell phones. Cell phones back in the day used to be pretty massive. And let's just take a look at a clip here to give you kind of an idea of what that looked like.
Hello, Zach Morris's phone.
Your track opens at noon and the first race is at 1? Okay, thanks. Bye.
That's a clip from one of my favorite shows, Saved by the Bell, something that I was growing up. That show took place, and that's actually post-80s. That would have been more the 90s. But what you're seeing there is that's what cell phones used to look like. They were a giant brick. They had a battery that lasted about 2 minutes. And the cell phone plans themselves were horrible. You had to wait until like after 9 o'clock to make a call that didn't cost you like $2 a minute. I mean, it was insane how expensive cell phone plans were. And the cell phone only did one thing. It called people. That's it. Nothing else. Couldn't take pictures, couldn't get on the internet. There was no internet to get on at the time. You couldn't Google anything because Google didn't exist. You could call people. That's it. There was no texting, nothing. That's what cell phones used to be. And they used to be basically a luxury for very rich people. That's more or less the only thing that they could do. But at the time, that was cutting edge technology. But that's people in the 1980s versus people now. And now people, I mean, I've even seen homeless people that have phones, smartphones. And so you're comparing the wealth of people in the 1980s to now. When you're looking at cell phones, there's just absolutely no comparison. And based on the competition that we've had, the competition between the big companies, we eventually got to the point where just about every cell phone plan is unlimited. You can call anybody for any number of minutes. Your data plan is basically unlimited now. That has gotten to the point to where, because of competition between the companies competing for your dollar, in other words, capitalism, eventually we got to the point to where virtually every cell phone plan is great, especially if you're comparing them to what was going on in the 1980s, where even calling somebody would cost you a ton of money if it wasn't done in your free minutes period. All right, well, let's look at TVs. Back in the 1980s, a 19-inch color TV cost about $450 to $500 according to tvhistory.tv. So you're looking at a 19-inch. That's not a huge TV set. A 19-inch color television, so it was in color, $450 to $500. A 26-inch Sony color TV was about $1,000 to $1,400 in 1982. Now, I want you to keep in mind, none of those figures are adjusted for inflation. That's just the raw number. If it were adjusted for inflation, it would actually be far more. So in $1980, we're talking about a 19-inch TV being about $500 and a 26-inch TV being anywhere from $1,000 to $1,400. And keep in mind, these were not smart TVs. They didn't have Netflix. They didn't have Wi-Fi. They didn't have YouTube. They couldn't connect to your cell phone. These were just TVs. And you probably had to buy a $20 or $30 adapter to hook them up to your Nintendo. This is not an exaggeration. This is how it was in the 1980s. And yet now we have big, I'm talking like, I think my TV, for example, it's a 48-inch, 47-inch, something like that. It's around that area. And it's a smart TV with all these features. I can watch Netflix. I can watch Amazon. I have basically TV a la carte. You can watch Sling if you want to. I have cable, all the hookups for all my game systems. And it wound up costing me about $300. Now, granted, I got a good deal on it, but you think about that. A high-def TV with picture light years beyond what was available then. And it's way cheaper than it used to be. If this horrible, evil, greedy capitalist society was really just gouging people and upcharging them, then how did our technology get that much better and the price get that much cheaper? I'm paying way less than I did for a far inferior system in the 1980s compared to today. And these TVs are available to the average person. There used to be a time where a poor person, they probably kind of had a crappy TV. Now you walk into just about anybody's house, regardless of their income, and they may not necessarily have a massive TV, but they got a pretty good sized television set. I mean, I can't remember the last time I went to somebody's house, even somebody that I knew didn't really make a whole lot, that they didn't at least have about a 30-inch TV. And so they're light years ahead of where we were in the 1980s. Let's look at cars. Cars are another thing that are kind of universal in America, especially in the South. Cars are way better and far cheaper. The Toyota Camry in 1980, well, actually, you don't even have to go back then. The Toyota Camry in 1997 would have been about 7% cheaper today than it would be in 1997, according to the Washington Post. And if you're looking at the BMW 3 Series, that is 13% cheaper, and the Honda Odyssey is 16% cheaper from about that same period, the mid-1990s. So we're not even going all the way back to the 80s. Even if you're looking at the 90s, which is far more recent, we're seeing that adjusted for inflation, they're about 13 and 16% cheaper. And you also have to keep in mind that they're cheaper despite the fact that they have a lot more features. We're talking about Bluetooth, AC, power windows, satellite radio, airbags. Now, some of those things sound standard issue today, and they are, like AC and airbags. But back in the year 1980, that wasn't necessarily the case. Not all cars had an AC system. They became more common by the 1980s, but it wasn't guaranteed. And power windows were kind of a luxury. They were add-on items that you had to pay for later. So when you're looking at this, I mean, it's just abundantly clear that we are richer in really every aspect of that. Let's look at houses. Houses are better. Let's go ahead and look at this graphic here. So if you're looking at this chart, the average house size in America, this is the average house size, so your square footage. You're looking at 1975, then go to 1980. You go all the way to about 2015, which is where this study ends. You're looking at the average house size and the median house size skyrocket, and the average household size actually goes down. So not only are you getting a bigger house, but you're getting a bigger house with less people living in it. So everybody has a lot more space when you're comparing from, a couple decades ago to the next one. So by every measure, Americans are getting far richer, whether you're looking at cars and houses or you're looking at, your tech stuff. In every respect of the word, we are getting more and more richer. We have more and more stuff available to us, and we're getting it at a cheaper price because of competition, because of the marketplace. So in 1980, we're floating at just around the 1,600 square foot mark. I'll bring that graphic up. If you're looking at the size of houses in 1980, we're floating at just about the 1,600 square foot mark. By 2015, you're seeing that we're at the 2,700 square foot mark. So that is a 60% increase in house size since 1980. Also notice that the average house size dropped by half a person. So again, we have less people living with more space. And we're also, you could say in all these things, well, you're dealing with tech, and because you're dealing with tech, tech just tends to advance, and so that's not really a great measure. But then we're looking at cars, and we're looking at houses, which have better features, better technology, and your house size is even increasing, so you're getting more for your dollar because of competition. You're saying, yeah, well, those aren't necessarily standard, and Americans do tend to buy bigger houses over time. Yeah, all of that's true because of the marketplace. But let's say you fall prey to those arguments. Let's say that you go for something that is standard for everybody across the globe. Everybody's got to eat. Everybody's got to eat. That's a pretty good measure for how well a country is doing economically. How much are they spending on food, and what percentage of their income is spent on food? So we did a little research on that as well. Let's look at this this graphic. So this is how much Americans are spending on food, their total food as a percentage of their income, and then food at home, and then food away from home. So you're looking at restaurants. Now, food away from home does increase a little bit. So you are seeing that as time goes on, people are eating out a little more, spending a little bit more of their cost of food on restaurants. But if you're looking at every other metric, it's going down by a lot. You're thinking about this as a percentage of your total income. We're looking at, in the 1980s, food is about 14% on total and about 9% of your food at home. So food that you cook at home, groceries, that kind of thing. In 2012, the total is a little bit under 10 and a little bit less than 6% for food at home. So in other words, if you're comparing now to the 1980s, we are spending about 3 to 4% less on our income on food. And when you spend less on essentials like food, you get to spend more on luxuries. So there is absolutely no metric that I've been able to find that you could look at Bernie Sanders' tweet and say, yeah, that has really caused a problem for the country. We're a lot less wealthy now. This idea that we have this shrinking middle class and that life's so much worse than it was back then because people were making closer to what they were with their bosses, there's not an ounce of truth to that. If everybody is wealthier, if everybody is doing better, again, to go back to my initial analogy, if everybody is making 5 times what they did then why do you care that the guy that is your boss is making 100 times more than you? Why is that a problem if everybody is wealthier? If we're living in a system that gives everybody cheaper things and gives it to them more abundantly, then why does anyone care whether or not their boss is making a little more than they are? I do not understand that argument. This income inequality thing, it doesn't make any sense. Why would you be upset about that? And really what it all boils down to is that socialism is billed as a force that combats greed. That's what they keep saying. We've heard that 1,000 times. It's like, well, capitalism is greedy, and people at the top are greedy. But socialism is built on envy. The whole idea of socialism is that there should not be people making more than other people. Regardless of their skill, regardless of the work that they put in or the risk or whatever, they're saying that all the outcomes ought to be equal. Well, that whole premise is based on envy. That's you being worried about what other people are having and you wanting to bring them down. you wanting them to not have things. But when you're talking about capitalism, everybody does better. Why do you care that there are other people that make more than you? It's silly and it's envious, and actually it's sinful to be so worried about what other people have and be worried that there are other people with more things than you. Socialism is the gospel of envy. The whole system is based on that premise. And that's the reason that it is evil and immoral, because it just brings everybody down to your level out of spite. And it makes everybody poorer. All socialism does is spread the misery around to everybody. And that's why it's abundantly clear that Bernie Sanders has no freaking idea what he's talking about when it comes to economics, and saying that everybody is worse off now than they are in the 1980s. So let's just go ahead and jump to the Chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Today's Chaplain Report, as you may recall from the past few weeks, if you've been paying attention, we're going through the book of Daniel. And I really do love the book of Daniel, and one of the reasons that I do is because of this passage is that it, as well as any book, shows God's providence and his favor towards those that love him and are willing to obey him. And we see that really on display in the book of Daniel, chapter 1, verses 15 through 17. At the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better than they were, and fatter than the use of those who had been eating the king's choice food. So this is talking about Daniel and his friends. So the overseer that continued to withhold the choice food and the wine that they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. For as for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom, and Daniel understood all kinds of visions and dreams. So if we're looking at this, one of the things that's important to note here is you remember that the overseer did not want them to just eat the vegetables and drink the water, because he was afraid that they were going to look sickly or homely, and when the king saw them, then he was going to be mad at the overseer for not making sure they were eating properly. But Daniel and his friends were saying, we can't eat the king's meat. It's not killed by a rabbi. It's not killed according to the law of Moses. There's unclean animals in there. We can't do it because it will defile ourselves. We will be going against God's law to do so. And so it took an incredible amount of faith for them to make this stand and say, we will not be defiled by this, even if it means that we get in trouble for it. And the overseer is saying, look, I understand where you're coming from, but he might kill me, and he might have my head if I don't do this. And so they offered this proposal. I tell you what, just give us 10 days, feed us the vegetables, feed us the water, and everybody else will eat the normal food. And then when you come back in 10 days, if we look like we haven't been eating properly or something like that, then we'll figure something else out. And so they accept this proposal in the overseer, because God had granted him a certain level of favor and compassion in his sight. They decide to go ahead and go along with it. But when it comes to Daniel, at the end of these 10 days, he and his friends looked actually even better than the guys that had been eating the king's food. And it says that they looked, fatter and fuller than all the youths there that had been eating the king's meats and everything else, the food that was designed to get them healthy, to get them ready for the king's service. And that shouldn't be possible. I mean, these guys weren't nutritionists, but they weren't idiots either. They knew that you weren't supposed to be able to get to the way that you were, Daniel and the other kids, when you're eating vegetables and drinking water, as opposed to everything else that the king had provided. And so the only explanation there is that God's providence was with them, that God provided them a way to obey his will because they had a desire to do so. And that's the way that it usually works. If we have a desire to do what God wants us to do, he is going to figure out a way. He is going to provide us a way to do so. Now, sometimes we're not going to like the consequences of doing what he wants. He promises us, and we see this from the teachings of Jesus later, that there are going to be times where following God's word is going to be really hard, where following God's word is not necessarily going to be easy. But he asks us to do it anyway, and he will always provide a way. See, Daniel had enough faith to say, you check us out at the end of 10 days, believe me, we are going to be all right, because God is going to figure out a way for us to be able to obey him. God is going to be able to provide a way for us to be able to do this without defiling ourselves. And not only did God do the bare minimum, not only did God just keep them at the place that they were or keep them on pace with the other boys, no, he did more. And that's the way that God usually does it. That not only were they, adequate, they were excelling. They were going above what they normally would have been able to do. And that's a pattern that God kind of has. We can think of, for example, with the prophet Elijah, when he goes and he makes the challenge to all of the pagan priests. And he says that, if your gods are real, call down some fire to offer sacrifice, and then we'll see how that goes. And of course, they do call down to their pagan gods, and they don't do anything. And Elijah calls down to his God, and not only does God send down fire, he sends down a lot of fire. And it not only consumes the sacrifice, but the altar that the sacrifice was sitting on, and the trench of water that was surrounding said altar. And so God tends to overdo things. And he does so not because he's trying to show off or because he needs all the glory, but because God knows that we need extreme examples to solidify our faith. And so God not only does what he said he would do, or does what Daniel said he would do, but he overdoes it. He goes to the point to where he makes sure that they are even better in appearance than everybody else. And that really, I think, would help instill faith and instill that the people around them are blessed by Daniel and his friends, thinking, wow, God really is with him. God actually is looking out for him. Maybe we should pay attention to what he has to say. And because of their faith, God gave them a way to thrive and excel. Not just make it, not just be okay. He gave them an opportunity to teach these other people that did not know God, that were not familiar with the law of Moses, that didn't know how much God loved them and care about them. He gave them an opportunity to help them spread his word. Now, God doesn't always do this. I'm not a prosperity gospel guy. And that's because the gospel is not a prosperity gospel. God's not always going to give you everything that you need to be well-liked in your circles. And by the way, let's also be honest, each of these characters, both Daniel and his three friends, also faced a lot of difficulty later on. So it's not like they wanted to obey God and then everything in their life went great from then on out. Because that's not what the lesson that the gospel is trying to give us, or the Bible is trying to give us. But when you're talking about this particular situation, God does sometimes do this. Sometimes, because we do care about God, because we want to obey him, sometimes he does give us certain advantages over other people and allows us to be able to thrive as a way to sort of show his power and his might and his infinite wisdom. And so it's pretty often that God will give his people ways to prosper and to grow. And you notice that what he's talking about when it came to giving them intelligence and the branches of literature and wisdom, look, God's people have often been given special ways, special privileges, special ways to prosper and grow. If you're looking at things like science, literature, technology, these were usually furthered by religious people. Now, granted, there are some exceptions, but the crux of Western civilization is built on Moses and Jesus. There were contributions from pagans as well. I mean, we look at, for example, Western civilization has a lot to pay tribute to when it comes to ancient Greece. But really, the cornerstones of that are the laws of Moses and the laws of Jesus. And so because of that, Western civilization excelled far past every other civilization because we honored and revered the Word of God. And that's part of the reason that we were able to bring the entire world literally out of the dark. and to be able to excel in the way that we've been able to do so. A lot of those things historically have been furthered by God's people. The Jewish people, for example, have been on the cutting edge of literature in the ancient world because it was a requirement that a lot of their boys had to be able to read. And so what you had historically was Israel, a very small but a very rich and powerful nation, despite not being militarily all that strong. And this is something that God often does for those who are willing to obey him and to do his will. And he also imparted to Daniel a special gift that we see at the end of verse 17 there. Daniel has the ability to interpret dreams. And we're going to see that come into play a lot later in this book, that God uses that gift in a way to reveal certain truths to people, and he has Daniel as the medium, the person that is able to explain to them the message that God is trying to convey, which is a really, really interesting thing that God does for Daniel, and it also grants him certain advantages and certain favors in the sight of those around him. In other words, part of the reason that Daniel was able to excel is because of the spiritual gifts God gave him in a very direct way as well. So I think the takeaway from this is that sometimes God blesses us for our own sake, but usually I think that if nothing else, it's a side part of it, that God blesses us as a way to show his power and his mercy and his influence in the world in other people. And I think that we as Christians should always be joyful and ready to be used as a testament, as a witness, as something to aspire to by other people. That other people should see how we are and how we interact with other people and see some of the things that we've been given. And we're able to give that glory to God and to point them towards God. It actually reminds me of something that my hero, C.S. Lewis, said, who's just a brilliant author. And one of the things that he talked about is that the reason that he wrote, for example, the Chronicles of Narnia, a fiction series, is because he wanted to point people back to the Bible. The goal of that wasn't for him to get all kinds of critical acclaim and sell a lot of books. The goal of that at the end of the day, and he was able to prosper off of that, but his real goal was so that people would read it and go, hey, this is really cool, and it's based off the Bible. Maybe I should go take a look at the Bible. Maybe I'll really enjoy reading that too. And that's the kind of thing that we should be willing to do. We should live our lives in such a way that other people look at the amazing things that God is doing in our life and say, this Christian thing is really worth checking out. And if God is able to do that for them, what can God do for me? And I think that if we're able to do that, then we're going to be able to spread the borders of God's kingdom much faster, which is really the mission of the church here on this side of eternity. So by doing that, we can actually be this conduit to point people towards God. There is no higher calling. Stay the course, friends.